Hi guys, welcome back to the reading corner. Happy Wednesday. We're going to finish the last three chapters of the A Series of Unfortunate Events, Book 1, The Bad Beginning. Chapter 11. How pleasant that you could join us, the hook-handed man said in a sickly sweet voice. Violet immediately tried to scurry back down the rope, but Count Olaf's assistant was too quick for her. In one movement he hoisted her into the tower room and with a flick of his hook sent her rescue device clanging to the ground. Now Violet was as trapped as her sister. "I'm so glad you're here," the hook-handed man said. "I was thinking how much I wanted to see your pretty face." "Have a seat." "What are you going to do with me?" Violet asked. "I said, have a seat," the hook-handed man snarled and pushed her into a chair. Violet looked around the dim and messy room. "I am certain that over the course of your own life you have noticed that people's rooms reflect their personalities. In my room, for instance, I have gathered a collection of objects that are important to me, including a dusty accordion on which I play a few sad songs, a large bundle of notes on the activities of the Baudelaire orphans, and a blurry photograph, taken a very long time ago, of a woman whose name is Beatrice. These are items that are very precious and dear to me." The tower room held objects that were very dear and precious to Count Olaf, and they were terrible things. There were terrible things. There were scraps of paper on which he had written his evil ideas, and an illegible scrawl lying in messy piles on top of the copy of nuptial law he had taken away from Klaus. There were a few chairs and a handful of candles, which were giving off flickering shadows. Littered all over the floor were empty wine bottles and dirty dishes, but most of all were the drawings and paintings and carvings of eyes, big and small, and all over the room. There were eyes painted on the ceiling and scratched into the grimy wooden floors. There were eyes scrawled along the windowsill, and one big eye painted on the knob of the door that led to the stairs. It was a terrible place. The hook-handed man reached into a pocket of his greasy overcoat and pulled out a walkie-talkie. With some difficulty, he pushed a button and waited a moment. "Boss, it's me," he said. "Your blushing bride just climbed up here to try and rescue the biting brat." He paused as Count Olaf said something. "I don't know, with some sort of rope." "It was a grappling hook," Violet said, and tore off a sleeve of her nightgown to make a bandage for her shoulder. "I made it myself." "She says it was a grappling hook," the hook-handed man said into the walkie-talkie. "I don't know, boss." Yes, boss. Of course I understand. She's yours." "Yes, boss." He pressed a button to disconnect the line and then turned to face Violet. Count Olaf was very displeased with his bride. "I'm not his bride," Violet said bitterly. "Very soon you will be," the hook-handed man said, wagging his hook the way most people would wag a finger. "In the meantime, however, I have to go and fetch your brother. The three of you will be locked in this room until night falls. That way Count Olaf can be sure you will all stay out of mischief." With that, the hook-handed man stormed out of the room. Violet heard the door lock behind him, and then listened to his footsteps fading away down the stairs. She immediately went over to Sunny and put a hand on her little head, afraid to untie or untape her sister, for fear of incurring, a word which here means bringing about, Count Olaf's wrath. Violet stroked Sunny's hair and murmured that everything was all right. But of course, everything was not all right. Everything was all wrong. As the first light of morning trickled into the tower room, Violet reflected on all the awful things she and her siblings had experienced recently. Their parents had died, suddenly and horribly. Mrs. Poe had bought them ugly clothing. They had moved into Count Olaf's house and were treated terribly. Mr. Poe had refused to help them. They had discovered a fiendish plot involving marrying Violet and stealing the Baudelaire fortune. Klaus had tried to confront Olaf with knowledge he'd learned in Justice Strauss's library and failed. Poor Sunny had been captured, and now Violet had tried to rescue Sunny and found herself captured as well. All in all, the Baudelaire orphans had encountered catastrophe after catastrophe, and Violet found their situation lamentably deplorable, a phrase which here means it was not at all enjoyable. The sound of footsteps coming up the stairs brought Violet out of her thoughts, and soon the hook-handed man opened the door and thrust a very tired, confused, and scared Klaus into the room. "Here's the last orphan," the hook-handed man said, "and now I must go help Count Olaf with final preparations for tonight's performance. No monkey business, you two, or I will have to tie you up and let you dangle out of the window as well." Glaring at them, he locked the door again and trampled downstairs. Klaus blinked and looked around the filthy room. He was still in his pajamas. "What has happened?" he asked Violet. "Why are we up here?" "I tried to rescue Sunny," Violet said, using an invention of mine to climb up the tower. Klaus went out over to the window and looked down at the ground. "It's so high up," he said. "You must have been terrified." It was very scary," she admitted, "but not as scary as the thought of marrying Count Olaf." "I'm sorry your invention didn't work," Klaus said sadly. "The invention worked fine," Violet said, rubbing her sore shoulder. "I just got caught, and now we're doomed. The hook-handed man said he'd keep us here until tonight. And then it's the marvelous marriage. Do you think you could invent something that would help us escape?" Klaus asked, looking around the room. "Maybe," Violet said. "And why don't you go through those books and papers? Perhaps there's some information that could be of use." For the next 2 hours, Violet and Klaus searched the room in their own minds for anything that might help them. Violet looked for objects with which she could invent something. Klaus read through Count Olaf's papers and books. From time to time, they would go over to Sunny and smile at her and pat her head to reassure her. Occasionally, Violet and Klaus would speak to each other, but mostly they were silent, lost in their own thoughts. "If we had any kerosene," Violet said around noon, "I could make Molotov cocktails with these bottles." "What are Molotov cocktails?" Klaus asked. "They're small bombs made inside bottles," Violet explained. "We could throw them out the window and attract the attention of passerby." "But we don't have any kerosene," Klaus said mournfully. They were silent for several hours. "If we were polygamists," Klaus said, "Count Olaf's marriage plan wouldn't work." "What are polygamists?" Violet asked. "Polygamists are people who marry more than one person," Klaus explained. "In this community, polygamists are breaking the law, even if they have married in the presence of a judge with the statement of 'I do' and the signed document in their own hand. I read it here in nuptial law." "But we're not polygamists," Violet said mournfully. They were silent for several more hours. "We could break these bottles in half," Violet said, "and use them as knives, but I'm afraid that Count Olaf's troop would overpower us." "You could say 'I don't' instead of 'I do,'" Klaus said, "but I'm afraid Count Olaf would order Sunny dropped off the tower." "I certainly would," Count Olaf said, and the children jumped. They had been so involved in their conversation that they hadn't heard him come up the stairs and open the door. He was wearing a fancy suit, and his eyebrow had been waxed so it looked as shiny as his eyes. Behind him stood the hook-handed man, who smiled and waved a hook at the youngsters. "Come, orphans," Count Olaf said. "It's time for the big event. My associate here will stay behind in this room, and we will keep in constant contact through our walkie-talkies. If anything goes wrong during tonight's performance, your sister will be dropped to her death. Come along now." Violet and Klaus looked at each other, and then at Sunny still dangling in her cage, and followed Count Olaf out the door. As Klaus walked down the tower stairs, he felt a heavy sinking in his heart as all hope left him. There truly seemed to be no way out of their predicament. Violet was feeling the same way until she reached out with her right hand to grasp the banister for balance. He looked at her right hand for a second and began to think. All the way down the stairs and out the door, and the short walk down the block to the theater. Violet thought and thought and thought harder than she had in her entire life. Chapter 12. As Violet and Klaus Baudelaire stood in their nightgown and pajamas backstage at Count Olaf's theater, they were of two minds, a phrase which here means they felt two different ways at the same time. On one hand, they were of course filled with dread. From the murmur of voices they heard on the stage, the two Baudelaire orphans could tell that the performance of the marvelous marriage had begun, and it seemed too late to do anything to foil Count Olaf's plan. On the other hand, however, they were fascinated, as they had never been backstage at a theatrical production, and there was so much to see. Members of Count Olaf's theater troupe hurried this way and that, too busy to even glance at the children. There were three very short men were carrying a large flat piece of wood, painted to look like a living room. The two white-faced women were arranging flowers in a vase that from far away appeared to be marble, but close up looked more like cardboard. An important-looking man with warts all over his face was adjusting enormous light fixtures. As the children peeked on stage, they could see Count Olaf in his fancy suit declaiming some lines from the play, just as the curtain came down, controlled by a woman with very short hair who was pulling on a long rope attached to a pulley. Despite their fear, you see, the two older Baudelaires were very interested in what was going on, and only wished that they were not involved in any way. As the curtain fell, Count Olaf strode off stage and looked at the children. "It's the end of Act 2. Why aren't the orphans in their costumes?" he hissed to the two white-faced women. Then, as the audience broke into applause, his angry expression turned to one of joy, and he walked back on stage. Gesturing to the short-haired woman to raise the curtain, he strode to the exact center of the stage and took elaborate bows as the curtain came up. He waved and blew kisses to the audience as the curtain came down again, and then his face once again filled with anger. "Intermission is only 10 minutes, he said, "and then the children must perform. Get them into costumes, quickly." Without a word, the two white-faced women grabbed Violet and Klaus by the wrists and led them into a dressing room. The room was dusty but shiny, covered in mirrors and tiny lights, so the actors could see better to put on their makeup and wigs, and there were people calling out to one another and laughing as they changed their clothes. One white-faced woman yanked Violet's arms up and pulled her nightgown off over her head and thrust a dirty, lacy white dress at her to put on. Klaus, meanwhile, had his pajamas removed by the other white-faced woman and was hurriedly stuffed into a blue sailor suit that itched and made him look like a toddler. "Isn't this exciting?" said a voice, and the children turned to see Justice Strauss, all dressed up in her judge's robes and powdered wig. She was clutching a small book. "You children look wonderful." "So do you," Klaus said. "What's that book?" "Why, those are my lines," Justice Strauss said. "Count Olaf told me to bring a law book and read the real wedding ceremony in order to make the play as realistic as possible. All you have to say, Violet, is 'I do,' but I have to make quite a speech. This is going to be such fun." "You know what would be fun," Violet said carefully, "is if you changed your lines around just a little." Klaus's face lit up. "Yes, Justice Strauss, be creative. There's no reason to stick to the legal ceremony. It's not as if it's a real wedding." Justice Strauss frowned. "I don't know about that, children," she said. "I think it would be best to follow Count Olaf's instructions. After all, he's in charge." "Justice Strauss," a voice called. "Justice Strauss, please report to the makeup artist." "Oh my word, I get to wear makeup?" Justice Strauss had on a dreamy expression as if she were about to be crowned queen, instead of just having some powders and creams smeared on her face. Children, I must go. See you on stage, my dears. Justice Strauss ran off, leaving the children to finish changing into their costumes. One of the white-faced women put a flowered headdress on Violet, who realized in horror that the dress she had changed into was a bridal gown. The other woman put a sailor cap on Klaus, who gazed in one of the mirrors, astonished at how ugly he looked. His eyes met those of Violet, who was looking in the mirror as well. What can we do? Klaus said quietly. Pretend to be sick? Maybe they'd call off the performance. Count Olaf would know what we were up to, Violet replied glumly. Act 3 of The Marvelous Marriage by Al von Coote is about to begin. A man with a clipboard shouted, Everyone please get in your places for Act 3. The actors rushed out of the room, and the white-faced woman grabbed the children and hustled them out after them. The backstage area was in complete pandemonium, a word which here means actors and stagehands running around attending to last-minute details. The bald man with the long nose hurried by the children, then stopped himself, looked at Violet in her wedding dress, and smirked. No funny stuff, he said to them, waggling a bony finger. Remember, when you go out there, just do exactly what you're supposed to do. Count Olaf will be holding his walkie-talkie during the entire act. And if you do even one thing wrong, he'll be giving Sonny a call up there in the tower. Yes, Klaus said bitterly. He was tired of being threatened in the same way over and over. We'd better do exactly as planned, the man said again. I'm sure they will, said a voice suddenly. And the children turned to see Mr. Poe, dressed very formally and accompanied by his wife. He smiled at the children and came over to shake their hands. Polly and I just wanted to tell you to break a leg. What? Klaus said, alarmed. That's a theater term, Mr. Poe explained, meaning good luck on tonight's performance. I'm glad that you children have adjusted to life with your new father and are participating in family activities. Mr. Poe, Klaus said quickly, Violet and I have something to tell you. It's very important. What is it? Mr. Poe said. Yes, said Count Olaf. What is it you have to tell Mr. Poe, children? Count Olaf had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, and his shining eyes glared at the children, meaningfully. In one hand, Violet and Klaus could see he held a walkie-talkie. Just that we appreciate all you've done for us, Mr. Poe, Klaus said weakly. That's all we wanted to say. Of course, Mr. Poe said, patting him on the back. While Polly and I had better take our seats. Break a leg, bawled Alaris. I wish we could break a leg, Klaus whispered to Violet, and Mr. Poe left. You will soon enough, Count Olaf said, pushing the two children toward the stage. Other actors were milling about, finding their places for Act 3. And Justice Strauss was off in a corner, practicing her lines from her law book. Klaus took a look around the stage, wondering if anyone there could help. The bald man with the long nose took Klaus's hand and led him to one side. You and I will stand here for the duration of the act. That means the whole thing. I know what the word duration means, Klaus said. No nonsense, the bald man said. Klaus watched his sister in her wedding gown take her place next to Count Olaf as the curtain rose. Klaus heard applause from the audience as Act 3 of The Marvelous Marriage began. It will be of no interest to you if I describe the action of this insipid. The word insipid here means dull and foolish play by Al von Coote, because it was a dreadful play and of no real importance to our story. Various actors and actresses performed very dull dialogue and moved around the set, as Klaus tried to make eye contact with them and see if they would help. He soon realized that this play must have been chosen merely as an excuse for Olaf's evil plan, and not for its entertainment value, as he sensed the audience losing interest and moving around in their seats. Klaus turned his attention to the audience to see whether any of them would notice that something was afoot. But the way the wart-faced man had arranged the lights prevented Klaus from seeing the faces in the auditorium, and he could only make out the dim outlines of the people in the audience. Count Olaf had a great number of very long speeches, which he performed with elaborate gestures and facial expressions. No one seemed to notice that he held a walkie-talkie the entire time. Finally, Justice Strauss began speaking, and Klaus saw that she was reading directly from the legal book. Her eyes were sparkling and her face flushed as she performed on stage for the first time. Too stage, too stage struck to realize she was a part of Count of Olaf's plan. She spoke on and on about Olaf and Violet caring for each other in sickness and in health, in good times and bad, and all of those things that are said to many people who decide for one reason or another to get married. When she finished her speech, Justice Strauss turned to Count Olaf and asked, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Klaus said, smiling. Count Olaf said, smiling. Klaus saw Violet shudder. "Do you," Justice Strauss said, turning to Violet, "take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Violet said. Klaus clenched his fists. His sister had said "I do" in the presence of a judge. Once she signed the official document, the wedding was legally valid, and now Klaus could see that Justice Strauss was taking the document from one of the other actors and holding it out to Violet to sign. "Don't move an inch," the bald man muttered to Klaus, and Klaus thought of poor Sonny, dangling at the top of the tower, and stood still as he watched Violet take a long quill pen from Count Olaf. Violet's eyes were wide as she looked down at the paper, and her face was pale, and her left hand was trembling as she signed her name. Chapter 13. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," Count Olaf said, stepping forward to address the audience, "I have an announcement. There is no reason to continue tonight's performance, for its purpose has been served. This has not been a scene of fiction. My marriage to Violet Baudelaire is perfectly legal, and now I am in control of her entire fortune." There were gasps from the audience, and some of the actors looked at one another in shock. Not everyone, apparently, had known about Olaf's plan. "That can't be," Justice Strauss cried. "The marriage laws in this community are quite simple," Count Olaf said. "The bride must say 'I do' in the presence of a judge, like yourself, and sign an explanatory document. And all of you here," Count Olaf gestured out to the audience, "are witnesses." "But Violet is only a child," one of the actors said. "She's not old enough to marry." "She is, if her legal guardian agrees," Count Olaf said. "And in addition to being her husband, I am her legal guardian." "But that piece of paper is not an official document," Justice Strauss said. "That's just a stage prop." Count Olaf took the paper from Violet's hand and gave it to Justice Strauss. "I think if you look at it closely, you will see it is an official document from City Hall." Justice Strauss took the document in her hand and read it quickly. Then, closing her eyes, she sighed deeply and furrowed her brow, thinking hard. Klaus watched her and wondered if this were the expression Justice Strauss had on her face whenever she was serving on the High Court. "You're right," she said finally to Count Olaf. "This marriage, unfortunately, is completely legal. Violet said 'I do' and signed her name here on this paper. Count Olaf, you are Violet's husband, and therefore in complete control of her estate." "That can't be," said a voice from the audience, and Klaus recognized it as the voice of Mr. Poe. He ran up the stairs to the stage and took the document from Justice Strauss. "This is dreadful nonsense. I'm afraid this dreadful nonsense is the law," but Justice Strauss said. Her eyes were filling up with tears. "I can't believe how easily I was tricked," she said. "I would never do anything to harm you, children." "Never. You were easily tricked," Count Olaf said, grinning, and the judge began to cry. "It was child's play, winning this fortune. And now if all of you will excuse me, my bride and I need to go home for our wedding night." "First, let Sonny go," Klaus burst out. "You promised to let her go." "Where is Sonny?" Mr. Poe asked. "She's all tied up at the moment," Count Olaf said. "If you will pardon a little joke," his eyes shone as he pressed buttons on the walkie-talkie, and waited while the hook-handed man answered. "Hello?" "Yes, of course it's me, you idiot. Everything has gone according to plan. Please remove Sonny from her cage and bring her directly to the theater. Klaus and Sonny have some chores to do before they go to bed." Count Olaf gave Klaus a sharp look. "Are you satisfied now?" he asked. "Yes," Klaus said quietly. He wasn't satisfied at all, of course, but at least his baby sister was no longer dangling from a tower. "Don't think you're so safe," the man whispered to Klaus. "Count Olaf will take care of you and your sisters later." He doesn't want to do it in front of all these people. He did not have to explain to Klaus what he meant by the phrase take care of. Well, I'm not satisfied at all, Mr. Poe said. This is absolutely horrendous. This is completely monstrous. Monstrous. This is financially dreadful. I'm afraid, however, Count Olaf said that that it is legally binding. Tomorrow, Mr. Poe, I shall come down to the bank and withdraw the complete Baudelaire fortune. Mr. Poe opened his mouth as if to say something, but began to cough instead. For several seconds he coughed into a handkerchief while everyone waited for him to speak. I won't allow it, Mr. Poe finally gasped, wiping his mouth. I absolutely will not allow it. I'm afraid you have to, Count Olaf replied. I'm afraid Olaf is right, Justice Strauss said through her tears. This marriage is legally binding. Begging your pardon, Violet said suddenly, but I think you may be wrong. Everyone turned to look at the eldest Baudelaire orphan. What do you say? What did you say, Countess? Olaf said. I'm not your Countess, Violet said testily, a word which she means in an extremely annoyed tone. At least I don't think I am. And why is that, Count Olaf said. I did not sign the document in my own hand, as the law states, Violet said. What do you mean? We all saw you, Count Olaf's eyebrow was beginning to rise in anger. I'm afraid your husband is right, dear, Justice Strauss said sadly. There is no use denying it. There are too many witnesses. Like most people, Violet said, I am right-handed, but I signed the document with my left hand. What? Count Olaf cried. He snatched the paper from Justice Strauss and looked down at it. His eyes were shining very bright. You are a liar, he hissed at Violet. No, she's not, Klaus said excitedly. I remember because I watched her left hand trembling as she signed her name. It is impossible to prove, Count Olaf said. If you like, Violet said, I shall be happy to sign my name again on a separate sheet of paper with my right hand and then with my left. Then we can see which signature the one on the document most resembles. A small detail, like which hand you used to sign, Count Olaf said, doesn't matter in the least. If you don't mind, sir, Mr. Poe said, I'd like Justice Strauss to make that decision. Everyone looked at Justice Strauss, who was wiping away the last of her tears. Let me see, she said quietly, and closed her eyes again. She sighed deeply, and the Baudelaire orphans and all who liked them held their breath as Justice Strauss furrowed her brow, thinking hard on the situation. Finally, she smiled. If Violet is indeed right-handed, she said carefully, and she signed the document with her left hand, then it follows that the signature does not fulfill the requirements of the nuptial laws. The law clearly states the document must be signed in the bride's own hand. Therefore, we can conclude that this marriage is invalid. Violet, you are not a countess, and Count Olaf, you are not in control of the Baudelaire fortune. Hooray, cried a voice from the audience, and several people applauded. Unless you are a lawyer, it will probably strike you as odd that Count Olaf's plan was defeated by Violet's signing with her left hand instead of her right. But the law is an odd thing. For instance, one country in Europe has a law that requires all its bakers to sell bread at the exact same price. A certain island has a law that forbids anyone from removing its fruit. And the town not too far from where you live has a law that bars me from coming within 5 miles of its borders. Had Violet signed the marriage contract with her right hand, the law would have made her a miserable contessa, but because she signed it with her left, she remained, to her relief, a miserable orphan. What was good news to Violet and her siblings, of course, was bad news to Count Olaf. Nevertheless, he gave everyone a grin. A grim smile. In that case, he said to Violet, pushing a button on the walkie-talkie, you will either marry me again, and correctly this time, or I will. Nepo, Sunny's unmistakable voice rang out over Count Olaf's as she tottered on stage toward her siblings. The candid man followed behind her, his walkie-talkie buzzing and crackling. Count Olaf was too late. Sunny, you're safe, Klaus cried, and embraced her. Violet rushed over, and the two older Baudelaires fussed over the youngest one. Somebody bring her something to eat, Violet said, He must be very hungry after hanging in a tower window all that time. Cake, Sunny shrieked. Arg, but Count Olaf roared. He began to pace back and forth like an animal in a cage, pausing only to point a finger at Violet. You may not be my wife, he said, but you are still my daughter. And do you honestly think, Mr. Poe said in an exasperated voice, that I will allow you to continue to care for these 3 children after the treachery I have seen here tonight? The orphans are mine, Count Olaf insisted, and will stay, and with me they shall stay. There is nothing illegal about some trying to marry someone, but there is something illegal about dangling an infant out of a tower window, Justice Strauss said indignantly. You, Count Olaf, will go to jail, and the 3 children will live with me. Arrest him, a voice said from the audience, and other people took up the cry. Send him to jail. He's an evil man. And give us our money back. It was a lousy play. Mr. Poe took Count Olaf's arm and, after a brief eruption of coughs, announced in a harsh voice, I hereby arrest you in the name of the law. Oh, Justice Strauss, Violet said, did you really mean what you said? Can we really live with you? Of course I mean it, Justice Strauss said. I am very fond of you children, and I feel responsible for your welfare. Can we use your library every day? Klaus asked. Can we work in the garden? Violet asked. Cake, Sunny shrieked again, and everyone laughed. At this point in the story, I feel obliged to interrupt and give you one last warning. As I said at the very beginning, the book you are holding in your hands does not have a happy ending. It may appear now that Count Olaf will go to jail, and that the 3 Baudelaire youngsters will live happily ever after with Justice Strauss. But it is not so. If you like, you may shut the book this instant and not read the unhappy ending that is to follow. You may spend the rest of your life believing that the Baudelaires triumphed over Count Olaf and lived the rest of their lives in the house and library of Justice Strauss. But that is not how the story goes. For as everyone was laughing at Sunny's cry for cake, the important-looking man with all the warts on his face was sneaking toward the controls for the lighting of the theater. Quick as a wink, the man flicked the main switch so that all the lights went off and everyone was standing in darkness. Instantly, pandemonium ensued as everyone ran this way and that, shouting at one another. Actors tripped over members of the audience. Members of the audience tripped over theatrical props. Mr. Poe grabbed his wife, thinking it was Count Olaf. Klaus grabbed Sunny and held her up as high as he could, so she wouldn't get hurt. But Violet knew at once what had happened and made her way carefully to where she remembered the lights had been. When the play was being performed, Violet had watched the light controls carefully, taking mental notes in case these devices came in handy for an invention. She was certain if she could find the switch, she could turn it back on. Her arms stretched in front of her as if she were blind. Violet made her way across the stage, stepping carefully around pieces of furniture and startled actors. In the darkness, Violet looked like a ghost, her white wedding gown moving slowly across the stage. Then, just as she had reached the switch, Violet felt a hand on her shoulder. A figure leaned in to whisper into her ear. I'll get my hands on your fortune if it's the last thing I do, the voice hissed. I'm gonna have it. I'll kill you and your siblings with my own 2 hands. Violet gave a little cry of terror, but flicked the switch on. The entire theater was flooded with light. Everyone blinked and looked around. Mr. Poe let go of his wife. Klaus put Sunny down, but nobody was touching Violet's shoulder. Count Olaf was gone. Where did he go? Where did he go? Mr. Poe shouted. Where did they all go? The Baudelaire youngsters looked around and saw that not only had Count Olaf vanished, but his accomplices, the wart-faced man, the hook-handed man, the bald man with the long nose, the enormous person who looked like neither a man nor a woman, and the 2 white-faced women had vanished along with him. They must have run outside, Klaus said, while it was dark. Mr. Poe led the way outside, and Justice Strauss and the children followed. Way down the block, they could see a long black car driving away into the night. Maybe it contained Count Olaf and his associates. Maybe it didn't. But in any case, it turned a corner and disappeared into the dark city as the children watched without a word. Blast it, Mr. Poe said. They're gone, but don't worry, children. We'll catch them. I'm going to call the police immediately. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny looked at one another and knew that it wasn't as simple as Mr. Poe said. Count Olaf would take care to stay out of sight as he planned his next move. He was far too clever to be captured by the likes of Mr. Poe. Well, let's go home, children, Justice Strauss said. We can worry about this in the morning when I've fixed you a good breakfast. Mr. Poe coughed. Wait a minute, he said, looking down at the floor. I'm sorry to tell you this, children, but it cannot allow you to be raised by someone who is not a relative. What? Violet cried. After all Justice Strauss has done for us? We never would have figured out Count Olaf's plan without her and her library, Claus said. Without Justice Strauss, we would have lost our lives. That may be so, Mr. Poe said, and I thank Justice Strauss for her generosity. But your parents' will is very specific. You must be adopted by a relative. Tonight you will stay with me in my home, and tomorrow I shall go to the bank and figure out what to do with you. I'm sorry, but that is the way it is. The children looked at Justice Strauss, who sighed heavily and hugged each of the Baudelaire youngsters in turn. Mr. Poe is right, she said sadly. You must respect your parents' wishes. Don't you want to do what your parents wanted, children? Violet, Claus, and Sunny pictured their loving parents and wished more than ever that the fire had not occurred. Never had they felt so alone. They wanted very badly to live with this kind and generous woman, but they knew that it simply could not be done. I guess you're right, Justice Strauss, Violet said finally. We will miss you very much. I will miss you too, she said, and her eyes filled with tears once more. Then they gave Justice Strauss one last embrace and followed Mr. and Mrs. Poe to their car. The Baudelaire orphans piled into the backseat and peered at the back window at Justice Strauss, who was crying and waving to them. Ahead of them were the darkened streets where Count Olaf had escaped to plan more treachery. Behind them was the kind judge who had taken such an interest in the three children. To Violet, Claus, and Sunny, it seemed that Mr. Poe and the law had made the incorrect decision to take them away from the possibility of a happy life with Justice Strauss toward an unknown fate with some unknown relative. They didn't understand it, but like so many unfortunate events in life, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it isn't so. The Baudelaires bunched up together against the cold night air and kept waving out the back window. The car drove farther and farther away until Justice Strauss was merely a speck in the darkness, and it seemed to the children that they were moving in an aberrant. The word aberrant here means very, very wrong and causing much grief direction. And that is the end of the book at the back beginning. Series of Unfortunate Events, Book 1. Bye, guys. See you on Friday.